Public opinion. Public opinion is the distribution of the population's beliefs about politics and policy issues. It's the study of American public opinion aims to understand the distribution about how we feel, or the distribution of our beliefs about how we feel about particular policy issues. There are many groups with a great variety of opinions in the United States, and it is an especially complex task to measure all of these people's ideas and their opinions about how the government should function. To understand why we measure public opinion, you have to understand the basic principles of our country. Our country, one of our very basic principles is, or the idea that our government is made to serve what the majority of the population want. Our representatives need to know what the majority of population wants in order to create laws that address the needs of the most of the people. Now, the framers didn't necessarily want our representatives to always respond to the desires of the people, because they knew that the people weren't necessarily that educated, but they wanted the representatives to have an idea of the wills and the whims of the people, so the representatives can then filter those ideas and make laws that were best for the country. It helps candidates who are running for office. That's pretty straightforward. You want to make sure that when you're campaigning and you're spending millions of dollars going from state to state, and you're spending millions of dollars on commercials, and you're spending millions of dollars on political consultants that are helping you run your campaign, you want to make sure you know where the people are. What do they want to hear about? What is their number one concern? So if you know what the people want, then you know what to say to them, and you know how to respond to them. So, you don't necessarily want to talk about something that's not relevant to the people, because then you as a candidate aren't relevant to the people. Now, the history of polling, and well, this is a quick history. Before, surveys were sent to a specific group of people, and that is exemplified in the election of FDR versus Alf Landon in 1936. This magazine right here, the Literary Digest, put out a poll asking subscribers of the magazine who they would like to see win the 1936 election, presidential election. And the Literary Digest poll predicted that Alf Landon was going to win. Now, the only problem is that the Literary Digest poll only asked people who could afford to subscribe to a magazine, who had telephones, and who had automobiles registered. Now, this is during the Great Depression, so obviously they were pretty much targeting the opinion of rich people, or people that were doing well off during the Great Depression. So the poll predicted that Alf Landon would win. Now, this map right here is an electoral map of that 1936 election. Remember, Literary Digest said that Alf Landon was going to win. Alf Landon would have won the states that are depicted in red. FDR won the states that are depicted in blue. So obviously the Literary Digest poll's prediction was incorrect. There's one particular person who was very interested in making polls more accurate, and his name was George Gallup. So in the 1930s, George Gallup saw the system of acquiring public opinion as flawed, and that's what he worked to do, is make it more scientific. And he said the major flaw was the fact that you are only asking a specific type of people how they feel. So what George Gallup did was create a more scientific approach to sampling. So here's a picture of George Gallup. He was Time Magazine's Person of the Year. And the key behind scientific polling is this idea of sampling. Alright, sampling is when you ask a very small portion of the population your question so as to determine the attitudes of the entire population. So the idea is that you're asking a small group of maybe 3,000 people how they feel about the government shutdown instead of asking the 300 million Americans that are in the United States. And Gallup used this technique. Now, the key to this technique is that you have to have random sampling. Okay. This technique operates on the idea that everyone should have an equal probability of being selected for the sample question or for the sample for questioning. So you're not just asking one type of person, rather you're asking every single type of person in the United States since we're so diverse. Like the Literary Digest poll only asked wealthy Americans. In a random sample, every single American would have an equal chance of being asked a question. So if we were sitting in the middle of the food court in Patrick Henry Mall and we said to ourselves, we are going to ask every fifth person that walks past me on my left what they feel about the government shutdown, that's going to be a random sample, because you're not saying I'm going to ask every white person that walks past me or every black person that walks past me. I don't care who it is, what their age is, what their gender, what their what their demographics are. Every fifth person is going to be asked a question, and a good sample will reflect the United States population. So we've been doing population study, and if 15% of the population is Latino, then ideally 15% of the people you've asked a question to will be Latino. If 13% of the population is African American, then 13% of the people you asked a question to would be African American, so on and so forth. Except we don't really sit in a mall and ask questions anymore. The way that polling is conducted now. So random digital dialing is when you put somebody's phone number into a computer and then it'll automatically call people. So everybody with a phone number, which still is not totally random, but everybody with a phone number has an equal chance of being asked a question. Okay, issue of accuracy. Even though polls are much more scientific than they used to be, like with the Literary Digest magazine, there is sometimes issues. They're not always perfectly accurate. Like after we started to use scientific sampling, in this case, the Chicago Tribune asked people through random sampling who they thought was going to, or who was going to win the presidential election, or how did they vote after the presidential election between Truman and Dewey. And based on polling, the Chicago Tribune believed that Truman was going to be defeated by Dewey, which was inaccurate. So there still are inaccuracies to the scientific polling. Now, one of the things that we do is we measure margin of error. Now, margin of error is the percentage or the chance of a poll being incorrect. Generally, margin of error is depicted by a plus and minus 3 points. Let me see if I can draw this for you. So plus, minus, I don't know if it's gonna, no, it's not gonna let me do a 3. Oh, there we go with freehand then. Alright, so at the end of your poll, you might see, let's see, 51% of Americans think that the Democrats are to blame for the government shutdown, and 49% of Americans think the Republicans are to blame for a government shutdown. Okay, margin of error would mean that you can add or subtract 3 to either of these numbers because there is a chance that the poll could be wrong. Now, margin of error, a couple of things play into margin of error. The first thing that plays into it is sample size. Now, even though we don't have to ask 300 million Americans what their opinion is about a particular piece of legislation, the more people you do ask, the more correct your poll is going to be. So if you can ask 800 people versus 300 people, the margin of error will go down in that poll where you've asked 800 people. Wording is also important. You don't want to lead people to the answer that you want. So, if you're asking a question about abortion, you don't want to ask the question, do you like killing babies? You want to ask the question, do you agree with this statement? Abortion should be up to the mother. Okay, agree or strongly disagree or whatever. You don't want to lead people to the answer that you hope they say. Timing. Gosh, you want to give people a chance to develop an opinion. So yesterday, Saturday, October the 5th, the United States conducted a raid on an Al-Qaeda stronghold in Libya. And the president ordered it without approval from Congress, so we went into another country and took down an Al-Qaeda operative. If we were to ask people about that today, most people would have had no idea that we did that, so they wouldn't have had enough time to develop an opinion of whether that action was right or wrong. So you want to make sure your timing is good. Okay, and then exit polls. Exit polls also, that kind of goes back to this. Exit polls are conducted when people leave the voting booth, and you ask them how they voted. Did you vote for or against Truman? Right? And in that Chicago Tribune story, people had voted for Dewey, and they were the only ones who were asked, so the exit poll predicted that Dewey won. Now, exit polls can be highly incorrect, and we're going to talk about exit polling a lot more and the negative effects of exit polls.